MERN core, general, Q1, Q20. Senashashabar. 1. What is the MERN stack? The MERN stack is a JavaScript-based full-stack development stack consisting of MongoDB, Express.js, React.js, and Node.js. It allows developers to use JavaScript end-to-end for building modern web apps. MongoDB handles data, Express and Node form the backend, and React powers the UI. Jarkshadow 2. Why choose MERN over MEAN? MERN uses React instead of Angular. React is lightweight, component-based, supports virtual DOM, and is easier to integrate with modern libraries. MEAN uses Angular, which is more opinionated and heavier. MERN provides more flexibility and a faster learning curve. And here 3. Explain the architecture of a MERN project. A MERN app typically follows this structure. React, frontend, sends API requests. Node does Express handle HTTP requests, routing. MongoDB stores and retrieves data. Data flows as JSON across all layers. This leads to cleaner code and easy integration. Munner 4. What is the virtual DOM in React? React maintains an in-memory representation of the UI called the virtual DOM. Whenever a state changes, React compares the virtual DOM with the real DOM using a diff algorithm, applying only the necessary updates, improving performance. Shash 5. What is JSX? JSX stands for JavaScript XML. It allows writing HTML-like syntax inside JavaScript, which React compiles to react.createElement calls. JSX improves readability and component structure. What is the role of Node.js in MERN? Node.js acts as the runtime environment for executing JavaScript on the server. It provides non-blocking I/O, event-driven architecture, and scalability for building APIs and backend logic. 7. What is the role of Express.js? Express is a lightweight backend framework running on Node.js. It simplifies routing, middleware handling, validation, authentication, and error handling. Example route, you can see the code in our conversation history. 8. How do React components work? Components are reusable UI building blocks. They can be functional or class-based, use props for inputs, and use state to maintain internal data. 9. What is a MongoDB collection? A collection is a group of MongoDB documents similar to a table in SQL. Collections store JSON-like objects and are schema flexible. 10. What is middleware in Express? Middleware functions execute before a route handler. They are used for authentication, logging, parsing data, and error handling. You can see the code in our conversation history. 11. Explain REST API. REST, representational state transfer, is an architectural style where clients communicate with the server using stateless HTTP methods like get, post, put, delete. 12. How do you connect Node.js with MongoDB? Using Mongoose. You can see the code in our conversation history. 13. What is Mongoose? Mongoose is an ODM, object data modeling library. It provides validation, schemas, models, and built-in query helpers. 14. What are React hooks? Hooks allow using state and lifecycle features in functional components. Common hooks: useState, useEffect, useContext, useRef. 15. What is useEffect? UseEffect runs side effects like API calls, timers, subscriptions, etc. You can see the code in our conversation history. 16. What is useState? useState stores component-level data. You can see the code in our conversation history. 17. What is CORS and why is it needed? CORS prevents unauthorized cross-domain requests. When React localhost 3000 calls Node API localhost 5000, we must enable CORS. You can see the code in our conversation history. 18. What is JWT authentication? JWT, JSON Web Token, is used for stateless authentication between client and server. The server generates a signed token and the client sends it with each request. 19. What is package.json? This file stores project metadata, dependencies, scripts, and configuration. Charter 20. What is Babel? Babel is a JavaScript compiler used by React to convert modern JS, JSX into browser-compatible JavaScript. MongoDB and Mongoose, Q21 to Q40. 21. What are MongoDB indexes? Indexes improve query speed by storing a sorted reference of fields. Without indexes, MongoDB performs a full collection scan. 22. How do you create a MongoDB schema using Mongoose? You can see the code in our conversation history. 23. Explain MongoDB document structure. Documents are JSON-like objects stored in BSON format. They consist of key value pairs and can contain nested objects or arrays. What is aggregation in MongoDB? The aggregation pipeline processes data using stages like match, $group, $sort. You can see the code in our conversation history. 2025. Difference between find and find1. Find returns an array of documents. Find1 returns the first matching document. 26. What is populate in Mongoose? Populate replaces referenced IDs with actual documents. You can see the code in our conversation history. 27. How do you update a document in MongoDB? You can see the code in our conversation history. 28. What are MongoDB operators? Operators modify documents. Examples: set, inc, push, match, group. 29. What is a replica set? A replica set is a set of MongoDB servers maintaining the same data for high availability. Har 30. What is a transaction in MongoDB? A transaction allows multiple operations to execute atomically, all succeed or all fail. There 31. What is a schemaless database? MongoDB is schemaless, meaning documents can have varied structures, offering flexibility. 32. What is the difference between SQL and NoSQL? SQL uses structured tables and rigid schemas. NoSQL stores data in flexible formats like JSON, allowing scalability and horizontal growth. 33. What is Object ID in MongoDB? A unique 12-byte identifier automatically assigned to each document. 34. Explain Mongoose model. A model acts as a wrapper around a schema and provides an interface for CRUD operations. 35. What are validation rules in Mongoose? Schemas can enforce validation. You can see the code in our conversation history. 36. How do you delete a document? You can see the code in our conversation history. 37. How do you handle MongoDB connection errors? Using try-catch and event listeners, you can see the code in our conversation history. 38. What is lean in Mongoose? Lean returns plain JavaScript objects instead of Mongoose documents, improving performance. 39. How do you sort data in MongoDB? You can see the code in our conversation history. What are capped collections? Fixed-size collections that overwrite oldest data when they reach size limit, used for logs, caching, etc. Express.js and Node.js, Q41 to Q60. And 41. What is ExpressRouter? ExpressRouter allows you to split routes into multiple files for better structure. You can see the code in our conversation history. Then mount. You can see the code in our conversation history. And 42. How do you handle errors in Express? Using custom error handling middleware. You can see the code in our conversation history. 43. What is async/await? Async/await simplifies asynchronous code. Async returns a promise, and await pauses execution until the promise resolves. 44. What is the event loop in Node.js? The event loop manages asynchronous operations in Node.js. It lets Node handle many requests non-blockingly on a single thread. 45. What are Node.js streams? Streams allow reading/writing data in chunks instead of loading entire data in memory, used in file uploads, video streaming, etc. 46. What is clustering in Node.js? Clustering allows Node to use multiple CPU cores by creating child processes, useful for scaling servers. 47. What is NodeMon? NodeMon automatically restarts your Node application when files change during development. 48. How do you secure an Express API? Common techniques. Use cores, use Helmet, rate limiting, JWT authentication, sanitizing inputs against SQL NoSQL injection. You can see the code in our conversation history. 49. Difference between CommonJS and ES6 modules. CommonJS require module.exports. ES6 modules import, export, default 50. What is middleware chaining? Multiple middlewares can run sequentially when calling next, used for validation, authentication, etc. 51. What is body parser? Body parser parses incoming request bodies like JSON URL encoded data, now included in Express by default. 52. How do you handle file uploads in Node? Using Multer, you can see the code in our conversation history. 53. What is rate limiting? Limit the number of API requests from a client to prevent abuse, DDoS attacks. 54. What is Helmet in Express? Helmet helps secure Express apps by setting various HTTP headers. You can see the code in our conversation history. And 55. What is a template engine? Engines like EJS, Pug allow dynamic rendering of HTML on the server. 56. What is JSON.stringify used for? It converts JavaScript objects to JSON strings, used for storing, sending data. 57. What is process.env in Node? It stores environment variables like DB credentials, API keys. You can see the code in our conversation history. 58. What is a 404 handler? A catch-all route when no other route matches. You can see the code in our conversation history. And 59. How to create a simple node server without Express. You can see the code in our conversation history. 60. What is the difference between put and patch? Put replaces entire resource. Patch updates only specific fields. React.js Advanced, Q61, Q80. 61. What are React fragments? Fragments allow returning multiple children without extra DOM nodes. You can see the code in our conversation history. 62. What is prop drilling? Prop drilling happens when passing props through multiple components unnecessarily, fixed using Context API or Redux. 63. What is Context API? A global state solution for sharing state across components without prop drilling. You can see the code in our conversation history. 64. What are controlled and uncontrolled components? Controlled. React manages the form input state. Uncontrolled, DOM manages the input state via ref. 65. What is React.memo? Optimizes functional components by preventing unnecessary re-renders. Useful when props rarely change. 66. What is useCallback? Returns a memoized callback function. Prevents recreating functions on every render. You can see the code in our conversation history. 67. What is useMemo? Returns a memoized value to avoid expensive recalculations. 68. What is Redux? A state management library with a single global store. Uses actions, reducers, and dispatch for predictable state updates. 69. What is a reducer? A function that returns new state based on action type. You can see the code in our conversation history. 70. What are React portals? Portals allow rendering components outside the parent DOM hierarchy, e.g., modals. 71. What is lazy loading in React? Load components only when needed using React.lazy. You can see the code in our conversation history. 72. What is suspense? Wraps lazy loaded components and shows fallback UI. You can see the code in our conversation history. 73. What is reconciliation? React's process of updating the DOM by comparing virtual DOM trees. -- 74. What is a key in React lists? A unique identifier helping React track items in lists. Keys improve rendering performance. 75. What are higher order components? OC. A function that takes a component and returns a new enhanced component. You can see the code in our conversation history. 76. What is lifting state up? Moving shared state to a common parent component so child components can share data. 77. What are React synthetic events? React wraps native browser events into cross-browser compatible synthetic events. 78. What is server-side rendering, SSR? Rendering React pages on the server instead of the browser. Next.js supports SSR out of the box. 79. What is hydration in React? Process where React attaches event listeners to SSR rendered HTML to make it interactive. 80. What is the difference between React and React Native? React, web applications. React Native, mobile applications using JS but renders native UI components. React, more concepts, Q81, Q81. What is the difference between state and props? Props, pass to child components, read-only. State, local data inside a component. Can change using setState or hooks. Props make components reusable. State manages dynamic data. 82. What is a custom hook? A custom hook is a reusable function that uses React hooks. Example. You can see the code in our conversation history. 83. What is the difference between useEffect and useLayoutEffect? UseEffect runs after paint. UseLayoutEffect runs before paint, useful for DOM measurements. 84. Why do we need keys in lists? Keys help React track items during updates for better performance. Without keys, React may re-render unnecessary elements. 85. What is React hydration error? Occurs when the server-rendered HTML doesn't match the client-side render. Common in SSR apps. What is a pure component? A component that renders only when its props state change, equivalent to React.memo for functional components. 87. What is strict mode in React? A development-only tool that identifies unsafe or deprecated lifecycle methods. Wrapped like, you can see the code in our conversation history. 88. What is the difference between useRef and createRef? useRef, used in functional components, persists across renders. CreateRef, used in class components, recreated on each render. Sure 89. What is reconciliation in React? React compares two virtual DOM trees using a diffing algorithm to apply minimal changes to the real DOM. 90. How does React update its UI? React follows. 1. Trigger re-render. 2. Compare old versus new virtual DOM. 3. Update only changed elements, patching. 91. What is React Fiber? React Fiber is a complete rewrite of the reconciliation algorithm to support time slicing, priority-based rendering, better performance. 92. What is shallow comparison? Shallow comparison checks references, not deep equality, useful for performance optimizations. 93. What is React.strict mode used for? Helps detect unsafe lifecycle methods, unexpected side effects, deprecated APIs. 4. What is prop types? A validation library to check props types at runtime. You can see the code in our conversation history. 95. What is the use imperative handle hook? It allows customizing refs exposed to parent components, used with forward ref. 96. What is forwarding refs? Allows passing refs through components. You can see the code in our conversation history. 97. What is a render prop? A technique to share code between components using a function prop. 98. How does React handle events differently from HTML? React uses synthetic events, improving performance and cross-browser compatibility. 99. Why React does not re-render on mutation? React detects changes using a mutable state. Mutating state directly won't trigger re-render. Chash 100. What is the cleanup function in useEffect? Used for unsubscribing, clearing intervals, removing listeners. You can see the code in our conversation history. Backend and APIs, Q101, Q120. 101. What is RESTful API? A RESTful API follows statelessness, uniform resource naming, standard HTTP methods, JSON responses, used heavily in MERN apps. 102. What is the difference between REST and GraphQL? REST, GraphQL, multiple endpoints, single endpoint, returns fixed structure. Clients request specific fields. Overfetching possible. No overfetching. HANA 103. How do you handle authentication in MERN? Using JWT for signed tokens, bcrypt for password hashing, auth middleware in Express, storing token in local storage/cookies in React. 104. How do you create a protected route in Express? You can see the code in our conversation history. 105. How do you create a protected route in React? You can see the code in our conversation history. 106. What is bcrypt? A hashing library used for password encryption. You can see the code in our conversation history. 107. What is JSON Web Token, JWT? A stateless token containing user data, used for secure authentication in MERN apps. 108. What is refresh token? A long-lived token used to generate new access tokens without relogin, stored securely, e.g. HTTP-only cookies. 109. What is the MVC pattern? Model, data logic, Mongoose models, Vue, UI, React. Controller, business logic, MERN aligns well with MVC. 1 in 10. How do you send data from React to Node? Use Fetch or Axios. You can see the code in our conversation history. MER 111. What is Axios? A promise-based HTTP client easier than Fetch. Supports interceptors, cancellation, etc. Nasharb 112. What is coarse error? Occurs when frontend and backend have different origins. Solved using. You can see the code in our conversation history. 113. How do you handle file storage in MERN? Options: Multers local uploads, Cloudinary, AWS S3, Firebase storage. 114. What is cookie parser? Middleware for reading cookies from requests. You can see the code in our conversation history. Hash 115. What is Express.js? Parses JSON request bodies built in since Express 4.16. 116. What are HTTP status codes? Examples: 200 OK, 201 created, 400 bad request, 401 unauthorized, 500 server error. 17. What is an API gateway? A layer that handles routing, authentication, rate limiting for microservices used in larger systems. 1 in 18. What is rate limiting in Express? Limits number of requests from a user. You can see the code in our conversation history. 119. What is PM2? A process manager for Node.js apps. Features: load balancing, auto restart, log management. 120. What is Node Mailer? A library for sending emails using Node. You can see the code in our conversation history. Advanced MERN concepts, Q121-1. 121. What is optimistic UI updating? Optimistic updates update the UI before the server confirms the change. Used in React apps for snappier UX. Example, immediately updating UI after clicking like. 122. What is debounce and throttle? Debounce executes function after user stops triggering, e.g. search typing. Throttle executes function at regular intervals, e.g. scroll events. 123. How do you create environment variables in React? Use .env file. You can see the code in our conversation history. Access via. You can see the code in our conversation history. 124. How to handle role-based authentication in MERN. Store user role in JWT and verify inside backend middleware. You can see the code in our conversation history. 125. What is the difference between local storage, session storage, and cookies? Storage persists accessible from local storage, Lotion storage until tab closes. JS cookies user-defined, JS plus server. Why use HTTP-only cookies for JWT? Better protection from XSS attacks since JS cannot access HTTP-only cookies. 127. What is a microservice? A small independent service that handles one function, auth, payments, etc. MERN monoliths can later be split into microservices. 128. What is horizontal scaling? Adding more machines nodes to handle increased traffic. MongoDB and Node support it naturally. 120. Vertical scaling, increasing power of an existing server, RAM, CPU. RAM 30. Okay. What is Docker and why use it in MERN? Docker packages apps into containers with consistent environments, helps in deployment and scaling. 131. What is CI/CD? Continuous integration and continuous deployment used to automate building, testing, deployment. 132. What is a build tool in React? React uses Vite, Webpack, Babel. They bundle JavaScript and optimize assets. What is tree shaking? Removing unused code during the build to reduce file size. #134. What is code splitting? Splitting code into smaller bundles to improve loading speed. You can see the code in our conversation history. 135. What is WebSocket? A full duplex communication protocol used for real-time apps like chat, notifications. 136. What is Socket.io? A library built on WebSockets for real-time communication in MERN apps. 137. How do you send real-time notifications? Using Socket.io, Firebase Notifications, Web Push API. Example emit, you can see the code in our conversation history. 138. What is load balancing? Distributing traffic across multiple servers, used with Node Cluster, Nginx, AWS ELB. 139. What is API versioning? Creating multiple API versions to avoid breaking older clients. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 140. What is reverse proxy? A server, Nginx, that forwards client requests to backend servers. Used for caching, security, load balancing. Schnarr System Design Deployment Q141 to Q160. 141. Explain high-level architecture of a scalable MERN app. Includes React SPA frontend, Node plus Express backend, MongoDB cluster, cloud storage, AWS S3, authentication, JWT Auth0, Nginx reverse proxy, CI/CD pipeline, Docker containers. 142. What is SSR versus CSR in React? SSR, better SEO, faster initial load. CSR, client-side rendering, faster subsequent loads, React SPA pattern. 143. What is Nginx used for in MERN deployment? Reverse proxy, load balancing, serving React build files, SSL termination. 144. How do you deploy a MERN app on AWS EC2? Steps. 1. Upload backend code to EC2. 2. Install Node++ Mongo or connect to Atlas. 3. Run server with PM2. 4. Build React and serve with Nginx. #145. How do you deploy React to Netlify? 1. Run npm run build. 2. Drag build folder to Netlify. 3. Set redirects for SPA. You can see the code in our conversation history. Why use MongoDB Atlas instead of local Mongo? Benefits. Fully managed, auto backup, global replication, high security, scaling support. 147. What is API caching? Storing API responses temporarily to reduce server load. Tools, Redis, CDN, browser cache. 148. What's the difference between PM2 and NodeMon? NodeMon, restarts on file changes development. PM2, load balancing, monitoring, auto restart, production. 1. What is a CDN? A network of servers delivering static files quickly. Used for React build, images, fonts. 150. What is database sharding? Splitting a database into smaller parts, shards, distributed across servers. MongoDB supports automatic sharding. 151. What is OAuth? An authorization protocol allowing third-party login, Google, Facebook. 152. What is Auth0? A ready-made authentication service using OAuth, JWT, SSO, social logins. 153. How do you create a production build of React? You can see the code in our conversation history. 154. What is linting? Checking code for potential errors or inconsistencies. Tools, ESLint, prettier. 155. What is a service worker? A script running in the background enabling offline caching, push notifications, PWA features. 156. What is HTTPS and SSL? HTTPS encrypts communication using SSL TLS, prevents MITM attacks. 157. How do you secure MongoDB? Use strong passwords, IP whitelisting, disable public access, enable encryption, use Atlas built-in security. 158. What is cron job in Node.js? Scheduled tasks using Node cron. You can see the code in our conversation history. 159. What is logging? Capturing app events and errors. Tools, Winston, Morgan, Log4j. What is Morgan? HTTP request logger middleware. You can see the code in our conversation history. MERN stack interview questions and answers. 51. What is CORS and why is it used? Answer. CORS, cross-origin resource sharing, is a security feature in browsers preventing requests from unknown origins. If your React frontend, localhost 3000, calls a Node backend, localhost 5000, the server must allow it. Fix in Node.js. You can see the code in our conversation history. 52. How do you secure passwords in MongoDB? Answer. Using bcrypt hashing. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. Never store raw passwords. 53. What is JWT? How does it work? Answer. JWT JSON Web Token is used for authentication. Flow. 1. User logs in. Server generates token with secret. 2. Token returned to client. 3. Client stores it. Local storage. Cookie. 4. Every request sends token in headers. 5. Server verifies token. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. NAR 54. What is useEffect and when does it run? Answer. useEffect is a React hook used for side effects like API calls, event listeners, subscriptions. Runs after initial render, after dependency changes. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 55. What is the virtual DOM? Answer. A lightweight copy of the real DOM maintained by React. Benefits, faster updates, efficient diffing, minimizes DOM manipulations. React updates only the changed parts of the UI. 56. What is the difference between SQL and NoSQL? Feature SQL, NoSQL, structural. Structure, structured, unstructured, semi. Storage, tables, collections, and documents. Schema, fixed, flexible. Example, MySQL, MongoDB, scaling vertical, horizontal. MERN uses NoSQL, MongoDB for flexibility. 57. How to connect MongoDB with Node.js? Using Mongoose, you can see the code in our conversation history. For 58, what is Redux? Why is it used? Answer. Redux is a state management library. Used when many components need same data, app grows large, data must be predictable. Core concepts: store actions, reducers. 59. Explain middleware in Express. Answer. Middleware is a function that receives rec, res, and next. Uses logging, authorization, parsing body, error handling. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. MERN 60. What is debouncing and throttling? Debouncing executes function after user stops performing an action, used in search bars. Throttling executes function at fixed intervals, used in scroll events. Example debounce. You can see the code in our conversation history. 61. What is JSX? Answer. JSX, JavaScript XML, allows writing HTML-like syntax inside JavaScript. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. JSX is compiled into React Create element internally. 62. What are controlled and uncontrolled components in React? -- controlled component. React controls the form input through state. You can see the code in our conversation history. Uncontrolled component. DOM manages input, use ref. You can see the code in our conversation history. 63. What is the purpose of useRef? Answer: useRef provides a mutable reference that doesn't re-render the component. Uses: access DOM elements, store previous values, store timers. Example: you can see the code in our conversation history. What is Express.js and why is it used? Answer: Express.js is a minimal Node.js web framework used to create APIs, handle routing, manage middleware, handle request responses. Example: you can see the code in our conversation history. 65. What is a REST API? Answer: a REST API follows REST architecture using get, read, post, create, put, patch, update, delete, remove. REST is stateless and scalable. 66. What is Mongoose? Answer: Mongoose is an ODM object data modeling library for MongoDB. Benefits: schemas, validation, middleware, query helpers. Example schema: you can see the code in our conversation history. Number 67. What is component lifecycle in React? 3 phases. 1. Mounting. Component renders for first time. 2. Updating. Component re-renders due to state props changes. 3. Unmounting. Component removed from DOM lifecycle equivalents and hooks. Component did mount, useEffect equals component did update, useEffect equals state. Component will unmount, cleanup in useEffect. Number 68. What is async/await? Answer: a cleaner way to write asynchronous code. Example: you can see the code in our conversation history. Benefits: readable, avoids callback hell, avoids promise chaining. Number 69. What is the difference between put and patch? Method, purpose, behavior. Put: update whole data, replaces entire document. Patch: partial update, updates only specific fields. Example: patch, you can see the code in our conversation history. Number 70. What is Helmet in Express? Answer: Helmet is a security middleware that sets secure HTTP headers. Example: you can see the code in our conversation history. Provides protection from XSS, clickjacking, MIME sniffing attacks. 71. What is React Router? Answer: React Router is a library used for client-side routing in React applications. Features: dynamic routing, nested routes, protected routes, URL parameters. Example: you can see the code in our conversation history. Number 72. What are URL parameters and query parameters? URL parameters, dynamic params, used to identify a specific resource. You can see the code in our conversation history. Access. You can see the code in our conversation history. Query parameters, filter, search. You can see the code in our conversation history. Access. You can see the code in our conversation history. 73. What is the use callback hook? Answer: use callback returns a memoized function to prevent recreation on every render, used when passing functions to child components, avoiding unnecessary re-renders. Example: you can see the code in our conversation history. 74. What is the use memo hook? Answer: use memo memoizes the result of a computation, used in expensive calculations, filtering, sorting. Example: you can see the code in our conversation history. 75. What are React fragments? Answer: used to group multiple elements without adding extra DOM nodes. Example: you can see the code in our conversation history. 76. What is the purpose of state management? Answer: to manage the flow of data between components. Needs state management when shared data across components, large applications, complex UI updates. Tools: Redux, useState, Context API. 77. What is prop drilling and how do you avoid it? Answer: prop drilling, passing props through multiple layers unnecessarily. Solution: Context API, Redux, useState example. Context use: you can see the code in our conversation history. Number 78. What is MongoDB aggregation? Answer: aggregation performs advanced data processing like filtering, grouping, sorting, summing. Example: you can see the code in our conversation history. 79. What is object ID in MongoDB? Answer: a unique identifier for each document. Structure: timestamp, machine ID, process ID, counter. Example: you can see the code in our conversation history. 80. What is async error handling in Express? Answer: using try-catch or external middleware. Example: you can see the code in our conversation history, or using an error handler. You can see the code in our conversation history. 81. What is the Context API in React? Answer: Context API provides a way to store and share state without prop drilling. Steps: 1. Create context. 2. Wrap provider. 3. Consume with use context. Example: you can see the code in our conversation history. Number 82. What is lazy loading in React? Answer, lazy loading loads components on demand, improving performance. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. Nar 83, what is the difference between NPM and Yarn? Feature NPM Yarn, speed, slower, faster. Security, weaker, earlier, stronger. Lock file, package lock JSON, yarn.lock. Commands, npm install, yarn add, both are package managers for JavaScript. Har 84, what is the purpose of package JSON? Answer, stores project metadata and dependencies. Includes name and version, scripts, dependencies, entry point. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. Schneidersch 85, how do you create a protected route in React? Answer, a route accessible only if user is authenticated. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history usage. You can see the code in our conversation history. Har 86, what is a model in MongoDB? Answer, a model is a wrapper for a MongoDB collection defined by a schema. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. A model provides CRUD operations, queries, validation. Nashstar 87, what is the difference between get and post? Get retrieves data, data sent in URL, not secure, idempotent. Post sends data to server, body used to send data, more secure, not idempotent. Sharp 88, what is Babel? Answer, Babel is a JavaScript compiler that converts modern JS ES6+ into older JS for browser compatibility. Works with JSX, JS, ES6, ES5, TypeScript, JS. Using Babel is required in React. Hadoop 89, what is Node package? Module? Answer, a Node module is a reusable file of JavaScript functions. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. Import, you can see the code in our conversation history. Hadoop 90, why is Node.js single-threaded? Answer, Node uses a single-threaded event loop to handle multiple requests asynchronously. Benefits, no thread management, high scalability, non-blocking I/O. Node handles heavy I/O well, but not CPU-heavy tasks. 91, what is clustering in Node.js? Answer, clustering creates multiple worker processes to utilize all CPU cores, improving performance. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 92, what is rate limiting and why is it used? Answer, rate limiting controls the number of requests a user can make in a time period. Used to prevent DDoS attacks, prevent brute force attacks. Example using Express. You can see the code in our conversation history. Staber 93, what is cross-site scripting, XSS? Answer, XSS is an attack where malicious JavaScript is injected into a website. Prevention, helmet middleware, validate inputs, escape output. 94, what is the event loop in Node.js? Answer, the event loop handles asynchronous operations in Node.js. Phases, timers, pending callbacks, idle prepare, poll, check, close callbacks. It makes Node.js non-blocking. Nashstar 95, what are indexes in MongoDB? Answer, indexes speed up query performance by creating fast lookup structures. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. Downside, extra memory usage. Now 96, what is the difference between map and for each in JavaScript? Feature, map, for each, returns, new array, nothing. Chainable, yes, no, used for transforming, iterating. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. Numberstar 97, what are promises in JavaScript? Answer, promises represent future asynchronous results. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. States, pending, resolved, rejected. Nar 98, how do you handle file uploads in Node.js? Using Multer, you can see the code in our conversation history. 99, what are higher order components, HOC, in React? Answer, HOC is a function that takes a component and returns a new component. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history, used for logging, permissions, enhancing features. 100, what are React keys? Why are they important? Answer, keys uniquely identify list items. Uses, improve rendering performance. Help React track item changes. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 101, what is the difference between session-based and token-based authentication? Session-based, stores login session on server, uses cookies, good for traditional web apps. Token-based, G, stores token on client, no server memory, ideal for mobile/PA apps. 1022, what is the purpose of NodeMon? Answer, NodeMon automatically restarts the Node.js server whenever files change. Run, you can see the code in our conversation history. Naberstar 103. What is Express Router? Answer. Router allows grouping and separating routes. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 104. What is the structure of a React component? Functional component, you can see the code in our conversation history. Contains logic, HTML, styling. 105. What is the difference between useState and useReducer? useState, useReducer. Simple state, complex state, easy to use, used for state logic, direct updates, uses reducer function. Number 106. What is a reducer function in React? Answer. A reducer accepts state and action, returning new state. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 107. What does npm init do? Initializes a project and creates package.json. Command, you can see the code in our conversation history. 108. What is Helmet in Express? Helmet adds security headers to protect from XSS, clickjacking, MIME sniffing. Install, you can see the code in our conversation history. 109. What is optimistic UI? UI updates before getting server response, making apps feel faster. Used in likes, votes, comments. Number 110. What are environment variables? Used to store sensitive configurations like DB URL, JWT secret, API keys. In .env, you can see the code in our conversation history. Nishtar 1111. What is the purpose of React strict mode? Detects unsafe lifecycles, side effects, deprecated APIs. Wrap, you can see the code in our conversation history. 112. What is middleware in MongoDB, Mongoose? Functions executed before or after certain actions. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 113. What is the difference between CommonJS and ES modules? CommonJS, Node.js default. You can see the code in our conversation history. ES modules. You can see the code in our conversation history. 114. What is the purpose of React Dev Tools? Used to inspect components, watch state, debug props, optimize performance. 115. What are portals in React? Render children outside the main DOM hierarchy. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 116. What is the difference between cookies, local storage, and session storage? Storage, persistence, capacity, sent to server, cookies, manual expiry 4 KB, yes. Local storage, permanent 10 megabytes, no. Session storage until tab closes 5 megabyte, no. What is hydration in React? Used on SSR Next.js. Browser attaches events to server-rendered HTML, makes page interactive. 118. What is bcrypt and why do we use it? Used to hash passwords. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. Benefits. Salted, one-way hashing. Secure. 119. What is the purpose of promise.all? Runs multiple promises in parallel. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 120. What is the difference between frontend and backend validation? Frontend, fast, user-friendly, can be bypassed. Backend, secure, final validation cannot be bypassed. 121. What is the purpose of CORS in web applications? CORS allows your front-end React to access API from a different domain, Node backend. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 122. What is the difference between synchronous and asynchronous functions? Synchronous, executes line by line, blocks next operation. Asynchronous, non-blocking, uses callbacks, promises, async await. 123. What is the purpose of useLayoutEffect? Runs synchronously before browser paints the screen. Used for DOM measurements, prevent visual flicker. Number 124. What is pure component in React? A component that prevents re-renders if prop state do not change. Equivalent in function components. You can see the code in our conversation history. Number 125. What is the difference between React.memo and useMemo? React.memo, useMemo, memoizes a component, memoizes a value, prevents re-render, prevents recalculation. Number 126. What are hooks rules? 1. Only call hooks at top level. 2. Only call hooks inside React components, custom hooks. Number 127. What is the difference between CSS modules and styled components? CSS modules, scoped CSS, imported as classes. Styled components, write CSS inside JS, component level styling. Number 128. What is the advantage of using MongoDB for MERN? Flexible schema, JSON-like documents, horizontal scaling, easy integration with Node. 129. What is a reference ref in MongoDB? Ref allows relations between documents. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. Nashter 130. What is populate in Mongoose? Fetches reference documents automatically. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. Now 131. What is the purpose of .lean in Mongoose? Returns plain JavaScript objects instead of Mongoose documents. Faster performance. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 132. What is the difference between filter and find? Filter, find, returns all matches, returns first match. Array method. NAR 133. What is CSRF? Cross-site request forgery, forces user to perform unwanted actions. Prevention. CSRF tokens, same-site cookies, double submit cookie. None 134. What is the difference between null and undefined? Null undefined. Assigned value default unassigned value. Intentional empty, not assigned yet. Narstar 135. What are template literals? String literals using backticks. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 136. What is the Node.js REPL? Used to test JS code, debug, prototype run. You can see the code in our conversation history. 137. What is the purpose of key property in lists? To help React identify which items changed. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. Narstar 138. What is the difference between res.send and res.json? Res.json. Sends string, buffer, or object. Sends JSON. Automatic formatting, JSON formatting. 139. What is the difference between state and props? State, props, mutable, read-only, owned by component, passed by parent, controlled by component, controlled by parent. 140. What is ternary operator in JS? Shortcut for if-else. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 41. What is debouncing? Executes a function only after the user stops performing action. Used in search inputs, live validation. NAR 142. What is throttling? Executes function at fixed intervals. Used in scroll events, resize events. 143. What is server-side rendering, SSR? Rendering UI on the server, not browser. Advantages, SEO-friendly, faster first load. Used by Next.js, 144. What is client-side rendering, CSR? Browser downloads JS, renders UI through React. Advantages, faster after first load, rich interactions. Used by React, Vite. 145. What is Next.js, a React framework supporting SSR, SSG, routing, API routes? 146. What is Express static middleware? Serves static files like images, CSS, JExample. You can see the code in our conversation history. 147. What is crypto module in Node.js? Used for hashing, encryption, token generation. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 148. What is promise chaining? Executing promises one after another. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 149. What is object.freeze? Prevents modification of object properties. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. Narshar 150. What is the difference between var, let, and const? Var, let, const. Function scoped, block scoped, redeclarable, not redeclarable, not redeclarable, hoisted, undefined, hoisted, no init, can reassign, cannot reassign. Schnarder 151. What is event bubbling in JavaScript? Event bubbling means an event starts from the innermost element and propagates upward to parent elements. Stop bubbling. You can see the code in our conversation history. Starnharm 152. What is event capturing? Opposite of bubbling. Event moves top down, parent-child. Enable capturing. You can see the code in our conversation history. 153. What is JSON.stringify and JSON.parse? JSON.stringify converts object, JSON string, JSON.parse converts JSON string, object. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 154. What is shallow copy versus deep copy? Shallow copy copies references, nested objects share memory. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. Deep copy, new memory allocated. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 155. What is a closure in JavaScript? A closure allows inner functions to access outer function variables even after the outer function has returned. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. Now 156. What is hoisting? JavaScript moves variable/function declarations to the top of their scope. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 157. What is the call stack? A structure that stores function execution in order. LIFO, last in, first out. 158. What is middleware chaining in Express? Running multiple middleware functions in a sequence. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 159. What is a schema in Mongoose? Defines the structure of a MongoDB document. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. Number 160. What is ref forwarding in React? Allows passing a ref through a component to a child DOM element. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 161. What is use imperative handle? Customizes ref values for parent components. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 162. What is the difference between window and document? Window, document. Browser window, HTML page, global object, DOM root, has events, provides nodes. Number 163. What is cookie parser in Express? Reads cookies from HTTP requests. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. Number 164. What is JWT refresh token? A long-lived token used to create new access tokens after expiry. Flow, access token, short-lived. Refresh token, long-lived, never 165. What is same-site cookie attribute? Controls whether cookies are sent with cross-site requests. Values, strict, lax, none. Number 166. What is error boundary in React? A React component that catches JavaScript errors in child components. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. Number 167. What are microservices? Architecture that splits an app into small independent services. Advantages, scalability, fault isolation, easy deployment. Number 168. What is horizontal versus vertical scaling? Horizontal scaling, add more machines. MongoDB uses this. Vertical scaling, increase machine power, CPU RAM. Number 169. What is middleware in Redux? Executes before reducer receives action. Example, Redux thunk. 170. What is Redux thunk? Allows asynchronous logic inside Redux actions. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. Number 171. What is Redux Saga? Middleware using generator functions to manage side effects like API calls, delays, background tasks. Number 1 has the difference between Axios and fetch. What is the difference between Axios and fetch? Axios, yes. Built-in, yes. No. Auto-JSON, no. Yes. Interceptors, no. Yes. Timeout, manual, built-in. The 3. What is SSRF, server-side request forgery? A vulnerability where attacker forces server to send requests on its behalf. Prevention, validate URLs, block internal IPs, whitelisting. 174. What is Helmet CSP? Adds content security policy, CSP rules to prevent. XSS, data injection. Example, you can see the code in our conversation history. 175. What is PM2 in Node.js? A process manager used to keep apps running, load balance, monitor performance. Run, you can see the code in our conversation history.